Let's talk about Joshua. I want to read to you the introduction to the book of Joshua that you would find in Eugene Peterson's The Message. And I want to give you the backstory, the background to Joshua, so that we can read the section of the scripture that we're going to have projected. We'll have a greater knowledge of its context. All right? Eugene Peterson writes, "The people of Israel had been landless for nearly 500 years. Where had they been landless? In Egypt. They were slaves. Remember the story? Joseph and the coat of many colors. How many remember Joseph? Put in prison. He finally made it to being one of the Pharaoh's assistants. He helped Egypt overcome a famine by getting the country ready, by saving up 7 years of grain in order to survive the 7 years of famine. And Joseph became a major political leader in Egypt, and he brought his family into Egypt. Now, this family was the family of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. They had been given a covenant from God, and this covenant came with a promise. The promise was, I'm going to give you a land and an inheritance. And from you and Sarah, Abraham, there's going to be a nation that cannot be numbered. And of course, Abraham and Sarah were too old for children, and they laughed, and they had Isaac. And Isaac had 2 sons, Jacob and, remember? The red-headed one, Esau, right? And there was a war between these 2 twins over the birthright, and Jacob fooled Esau into giving up his birthright for a bowl of brown beans and cornbread. Now, I might have considered that sometime in my life. Some brown beans, cornbread, some fresh, ripe tomatoes, some green onions. Does that sound good to anybody? Come on, am I the only one? I'd have given my birthright for that bowl of brown beans and cornbread right now. I'd have given it up. Well, Esau surrendered his birthright. He was the eldest. Jacob wanted the covenant. Jacob had how many sons? 12. One of them was Joseph. He loved Joseph. They were all jealous of Joseph. They thought about killing him, but they sold him off into slavery. And then when we get to the end of the story, it's Joseph who saves them from starvation. And so now the family just takes up root. They just take root there in Egypt, and they live there for a period of time under the favor of Joseph. But the Bible says a Pharaoh came around that knew not Joseph, and he saw the Hebrews as a threat, and he enslaved them. And for 400 years, they lived in Egypt as slaves. The people of Israel had been landless for nearly 500 years. The fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and his 12 sons, had been nomads in the land of Canaan, and that was followed by a long period of slavery in Egypt, over 400 years. A miraculous deliverance into freedom led by Moses, and then 40 years of testing and training for living as free people under God's guidance and blessing in the wilderness. The company camped at Jordan on the day that opens the book of Joshua, had nearly half a millennium of slavery behind them. They were a disposed ragtag crew and only were very recently set free. This transition from being landless slaves to land-holding free men and women was huge. And Joshua was called to lead the transition. And so, when we read the text, we are standing on the opposite shore of the Jordan River, looking into the promised land, and Joshua is preparing this new generation to enter into the promised land. Joshua, not Moses. Moses died in the wilderness. And Joshua and Caleb and a few others who had escaped the slavery of Egypt were now prepared to enter into the promise. And so let's read that text. So it was their children whom he raised up in their place, God, who raised up in their place that Joshua circumcised. Now, circumcision was a mark of the covenant. It goes back to Abraham. Those that left Egypt were circumcised, but during the 40-year period of wandering in the wilderness, no one was circumcised. So before they could enter into the promised land, they needed to be marked by the promise. It was permanent. Right? Circumcision is permanent. For you young people who don't know what that is, ask your daddy or your granddaddy. Well, y'all can talk about that later during lunchtime at Western Sizzling. Y'all go talk about that there. Right. So, they were going to be permanently marked for the promise before they entered into the promise. For they were uncircumcised because they had not been circumcised yet on the way. When the circumcising of the whole nation was finished, they remained in their places in the camp until they were healed. And the Lord said to Joshua, "Today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you." And so the name of that place is called Gilgal or Galgal to this day. While the people of Israel were encamped at Gilgal, they kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month in the evening on the plains of Jericho. And the day after the Passover, on that very day, they ate of the produce of the land, unleavened cakes and parched grain. Now that's not milk and honey. Anybody ever ate unleavened cakes and parched grain? That's not very tasty. Doesn't have much of a taste at all. Unleavened cakes, kind of bland. Parched grain, it's kind of like eating popcorn seeds. Anybody here like eating popcorn? The seeds that don't pop? I kind of like doing that. I like to eat those. I don't know why. I've always liked eating those. So we're not talking about a 5-course meal. We're not talking about milk and honey in the promised land. You see, when they think of the promised land, they think of big bushels of grapes and large game and milk and honey and excess. The land was flowing with all that the things that they would dream of living in the land of Egypt. But they don't start eating and drinking milk and honey. They begin the process with unleavened cakes and parched grain. And the manna ceased the day after they ate of the produce of the land. What was manna? Bread, miracle bread that they would gather. And there were rules to gathering manna. You couldn't hoard up manna. You could only gather what you could eat for the day. And then on the day before the Sabbath, you could gather up enough to eat on the Sabbath, but you couldn't gather any on the Sabbath. This manna was a gift, quail, fresh water. God provided for the children of Israel rations in the wilderness. They got mad. They didn't like manna anymore. So God sent them quail. They didn't like quail. God said, too bad. Manna or quail. Pick one. That's the menu out here in the wild. Bear Grylls may have helped them eat a few other things, maybe a few slugs or, bugs. Anybody watch Bear Grylls, some of these survival shows and the stuff that they eat and the little, man, there's not a bug he wouldn't eat, I don't think. Well, God provided them quail and manna, but on the day that they ate of the unleavened cakes and parched grain that came out of the promised land, the manna dried up. It ceased. And the manna ceased the day after they ate of the produce of the land, and there was no longer manna for the people of Israel, but they ate of the fruit of the land of Canaan that year. All right, so let's talk about it. Slavery. 400 years. How many years have we been a nation here in North America? How old is the United States? You can give me a round number. Depending on this election, we may not be around much longer, but in 1776, how long have we been around? And right? What about 1976? So you're looking at a bicentennial. So we're getting up there. We're over 200 years old. The people of Israel were slaves for almost twice the amount of period that we've been a country. Think about it like that. And all of a sudden, God raises up a Moses who confronts the Pharaoh and has to convince the people of Israel to follow him. Because now, you see, look, when you're a slave, there's a lot to complain about. When you're a slave, there's a lot to complain about, but at least you have a place to stay. Right? And you got food. You may not like the food, but your masters are going to keep you alive as long as they need you for something. So they need to keep you strong. You don't have to grow your food. The food is produced for you so that you can continue to serve your masters. Now, it's not easy being a slave, but in many ways it's much harder to be free. It's much harder to be free. It's easy to be dependent upon somebody else for your resources, but it's much tougher to be free. God was not just calling the Israelites out of slavery, but He was calling them into freedom. Freedom. And that freedom was going to cost them something. They were going to have to learn to live to be free. And to walk in that freedom by faith in a God who delivered them from their slavery. See, they didn't get out themselves. They didn't storm the Bastille. They didn't attack the guards. They didn't kill their slave masters. God led them out. And He led them into the wilderness. And during that 40 years, some good things happened and some bad things happened. Last week, out of 1 Corinthians chapter 10, we learned that there were those who were disobedient to God. Those same folk who were led out of Egypt, they died in the wilderness because of their lack of faith. They chose idolatry. They built a golden calf. While Moses was literally on Mount Sinai receiving the commandments, they built a golden calf to worship. You've got to be kidding me. And they quickly disintegrated into idolatry. Sexual immorality. They grumbled and they complained and they had their freedom, but it was never enough. Because in Egypt, they had conveniences. And oftentimes we choose slavery over freedom because of the conveniences of slavery. There are people in the former Soviet Union right now that would love to see the return of the tyranny of communism. Why? Because they didn't have to work to make a living. They were given their bread and water. And they would give up their freedom for those conveniences. Now, how do you counteract that? How do you transform slaves into free people when they don't have the desire to be free people? You take them into the wilderness. You take them into the wilderness. And if slaves, if they don't want to work, to eat in the wilderness, and there's no slave master to provide for them, then they will go hungry. But God is gracious. He provided manna. He provided quail, but they had to catch it. They had to go and get it and bring it in. There were rules on how to utilize it. He was being gentle with them in the wilderness. He provided for them, but He was trying to nurture in them a spirit of freedom. But sadly, most of those slaves, most of God's children who were raised in slavery, they died in the wilderness. Do you remember the story of when Moses sent in the spies? They got right up to the river. They got to the point where Joshua is right now. They got to the same place. They were there on the other side of the Jordan. And they sent 12 spies in to scout out Jericho and the surrounding area. And 10 of those spies came back and said, "Man, let me tell you, what you thought the land of milk and honey was going to be, it's 10 times better." And they brought back this big vineyard of grapes. They carried it in. Big, giant. In my imaginative mind, I can imagine grapes that big around, bigger than grapefruit. They carried it in. And I can imagine all the people who'd been in Egypt thinking, "Yes, fantastic. Look at all the produce. Look at it. We're going to go into Eden. We're going to go live in this great garden, and it's all going to be provided for us." And then the 10 spies said, "Oh, but wait a minute. There are big giants in that promised land, and they're not going to want us to have any of this stuff, and they're going to step on us like little grasshoppers." And the 10 spies, the 10 of the 12, demoralized the people of Abraham, the children of Abraham. They so demoralized these ex-slaves that they went back into the wilderness. But there were two spies that went into that with the other 10. They came back and said, "Oh yeah, it's great. And they're big giants. But we've got a bigger God." And one of those was Joshua. Joshua. And so now Joshua has come full circle back to that same spot. It's now his generation that has the choice to make. Now, there are mysteries here in this text about the name Gilgal. Gilgal is an interesting name, and there are 5 Gilgals in the Old Testament, and some scholars say none of the 5 are exactly the same spot, and we really don't know what Gilgal means specifically in this context. It has various meanings. It could mean to roll, if you're thinking about a verb. If you're thinking about a noun, It could be a place of a round religious place, almost like Stonehenge in a way, where the stones are placed in a circle. It could mean to dance in a circle. It could mean to roll up a scroll. Gilgal has a lot of different meanings. And I found it very interesting that God would say to Joseph, today I'm going to roll up your shame. I'm going to roll away your shame, the shame of Egypt. I'm going to roll up that shame. I'm going to roll away that shame. And y'all going to call this place Gilgal because we rolled up your shame. Now think about that. What shame is he talking about? What's the shame? What's the shame that can kill a person in the wilderness? What is the shame that can cripple people and keep them from entering into God's promise? What is that? What are those shames? Well, I can offer three. I'll offer three. Slavery. Slavery itself, it is a shameful oppression. The shame of slavery, of being oppressed and dominated, of being overpowered. It does something to people. People who've been in prison, people who've been held captive against their will, cultures that have been oppressed. Those folk, they don't look you in the eyes. They carry a shame of second-class shame. We're not as good as you. We can never be as good as you. Our children can never be as good as your children. There's a shame that comes with slavery. That's going to be rolled away. That's going to be taken away. You're going to be God's people. You've always been God's people. And God's going to remove that shame because you're not a slave. You're a son. You're a daughter of the Most High God. That shame's going to be taken. When you enter in the promised land, you're not going to take the shame of slavery with you. It stays on this side. It's going to stay on this side of the river. Then you have the shame of sin. This is different from slavery. This is what people do to you, but sin is the slavery of evil that we carry in the human heart. And we see that. We see the slaves that leave Egypt, but they still are sinful people, and they need deliverance. They need rescue, not just from Egyptians, but from the sin in their hearts. Why is it that people who've just watched Moses perform miracles and break the military back of the most powerful nation on the face of the earth, why is it that within less than a few months they're building a golden calf at the foot of Mount Sinai? How can that be? Sin is why that is. Sin. And we're all slaves to it. Paul talks about it in Romans. He says, the things I want to do, I don't do. The things I don't want to do, I wind up doing. Why? Because of the power of sin. We're slaves to sin. That's his very language in Romans. And there's a shame that comes with sin. And many Christians are crippled by that shame of sin because they know they have this hidden sin in their lives, but they cannot live freely and they can't serve their church. They can't testify to what Jesus has done for them because they're still slaves. The Methodist movement was about breaking the shame of economic oppression among the poor and about breaking the shame and setting free the captives of sin. You can be free from sin like you can be set free from slavery. You don't have to carry that sin shame anymore. And then there's the shame of no identity. They were stateless. They didn't have land. It was very important for people to have ownership of land. Land gave a people identity. And in the wilderness, they wandered over somebody else's property. No, they just wandered in the wilderness. Now, they're going to have a place. They're going to inherit what Abraham was promised. All that shame was going to be rolled away. It's going to be rolled away. Now, I'll just tell you what my opinion is about Gilgal. And it may change tomorrow. Call me tomorrow and ask me and see if I still believe what I'm about to tell you. This is my opinion. I love the notion of circle. You're aware of the turn of phrase, you've come full circle? You've come full circle. I think that the name Gilgal, that our English turn of phrase, coming full circle, is embedded in that name Gilgal. That where Abraham started in Canaan and they were enslaved in Egypt, they've come full circle. I also believe that for Joshua, it was specifically for him because he'd come full circle. He'd been there before, a generation earlier, and they walked away, too afraid to receive God's promise. Joshua had come full circle. But now there were a group of people who were not going to be intimidated by the giants in the land. They had lived out their whole lives, not as slaves, but they'd lived out their whole lives in the wilderness. They knew how to survive in the wilderness. Now they were tough enough, free enough in their minds. They trusted God enough. They could face the enemies across the river. Joshua had come full circle. Now, there's also a New Testament application, and I'll give this to you. Did you know that Jesus and Joshua in Hebrew are the same name? Do you know it? Yeshua. And make no mistake, on that Easter Sunday, when that stone was rolled away, make no mistake that Jesus' resurrection has the power to remove every source of shame that can enslave humanity. Make no mistake that that image is not there. Where we started in the garden, walking in the cool of the afternoon in the Garden of Eden, where sin pushed us east of Eden, where sin shamed generation after generation of humanity. Jesus was going to remove that shame through his death and resurrection. That's Yeshua, rolling away our shame. Now let me say this. Churches, we go through a period of enslavement and wilderness wandering, and we stand at the banks of the Jordan River looking into the Promised Land. Churches find themselves in decline, and we've read a book, and many of us we're familiar with the book, The Autopsy of a Deceased Church by Thomas Rainier, and there he describes what slavery is for the church. It's slow erosion, it's decline through death and people moving away, and people move and they leave and they're never added back to. The past becomes the golden era, and we lose hope for the future. We become disconnected from our community. The people around us that we should have relationships with, we find ourselves in isolation, even in the midst of a community, of a college. We forget the Great Commission. We forget about what it means to take the gospel into all the world and to make disciples. We forget that part of who we are. Like the children of Israel, they forgot about the covenant of Abraham. We forget about the commission of God given to us to preach the gospel and to make disciples. We become preference-driven. We build up churches around worship preferences. and the things that we like versus the things we don't like, at the expense of the Great Commission. We lack prayer, the importance of prayer, a dependency on prayer. Churches that come out of slavery and survive the wilderness lean overtly, specifically, consciously on prayer, on God's provision to make the way, to defeat the enemy, to reconnect with the community. Churches that find themselves in slavery, they lack a clear purpose. Sometimes the purpose is reduced down to survival. It's a slave mentality when we're just about surviving. And oftentimes we become obsessed with our stuff, our facilities. That defines slavery for a church. And then during the wilderness phase, as we come out of that and we make choices that we're not going to die in Egypt. We may die in the wilderness, we may die in the promised land, but we're not dying here. We are not dying here. We're not dying here. We're going to step out in faith. We're going to trust the Lord. We're going to trust the Lord to get us across the Red Sea. And if we die in the sea, so be it. We're not dying here. And when the Lord gets us across the Red Sea, we're going to die. If we die in starvation in the wilderness, so be it. But we're not dying in Egypt. And God provides. And God provides. And we make a decision. We trust God. We lean on God. God provides. We grow in our faith. And we live ourselves out of that slave mentality. And before you know it, we become free people. Free to serve, free to be fruitful, free to enter into God's promises, free to trust God, free to be available to do what God would have us to do. Our own United Methodist Bishop, Robert Schnase, he gave us a book called The 5 Practices of Fruitful Congregations, Radical Hospitality. That means we invite people that are different from us. We practice passionate, and may I add, indigenous worship. Worship that lifts our eyes up to the Lord, that reorients us to who we serve, and who has made the promise, who has given us this covenant. What has Jesus done for us? This is where we are able to gather in gratitude and worship. Intentional faith development. How do we make disciples? How do we do it? How do we take somebody off the streets that rejects the notion that God even exists, and how do we invite them into saving faith? How do we do that? There are methodologies that used to work that no longer work. Billy Graham revival crusades, they worked at one point, but they don't work anymore. What will work? What will work for us? Risk-taking mission and service. Our existence is in mission and in service. We're here to serve at God's choosing, at God's pleasure, and not for our own. An extravagant generosity. We give with no strings attached. We don't use giving as a way of leveraging. We give out of a sense of gratitude. God got us out of slavery. What do I have that isn't already God's? What I had in Egypt was nothing. I didn't even have my own life. And what God has done for me, He's given me everything. What is it that I have that God hasn't given me? And we worship and we serve. Now this is the wilderness stuff. We have to relearn these characteristics in the wilderness. But there's even more. It gets tougher. It gets tougher. It's tougher to leave the convenience of slavery. And it's tougher now to leave the manna behind and to learn to eat off the land. And what we're going to study from after Easter all the way through, as long as we can, we're going to study what it looks like to live and to thrive in the promised land. There are giants there. Make no mistake. There will be challenges. You have to bring your mature faith across the Jordan. It's not easy. It's not the Garden of Eden. It is the promised land, but there are giants there. So how is it that we as a church, as we transition into the promised land existence that God has called us, what are we going to have to learn to do? I can give you those real quickly, and we're going to study them in specifics for the months to come. We're going to have to learn, again, to pray, and to pray as families and as a church and as individuals. We're going to have to pray. Not just tell God my needs, but to hear God speak and lead us into certain places, to say certain things, to do certain things. We have to refine our ear to prayer. We're already engaging in children's ministries. Children's ministries is promised land living. This is where we do our best evangelism with children and youth. We have to think in terms of evangelism. We can't just hold a revival anymore. Evangelism has to look differently. So how are we going to do that? We don't need an evangelism committee. Every member of this church, you are an evangelist at some level. At some level. We need to help you understand that. This is promised land living. Youth ministries, children's ministries, they go together. Number 5, leadership that reflects spiritual maturity. A clear and focused mission. How is it that we can assimilate? Number 7. We talked about it in our Sunday school class. Christy Cox said, what would happen if 5 new families joined our church? Where would the adults go to Sunday school? Are we ready for growth? God help us if 50 people who come to our candy drop decide to just show up on Sunday morning. What would that look like? We got to get ready to assimilate, not just to accommodate them spatially, but to make disciples of them. Do we have enough leaders that know what it is to be a disciple to help others become disciples? This is about promised land living. Slaves don't have to worry about raising up the next generation. Their masters will take care of that. But you see, we're going to be living in the promised land. We got to think about developing godly leaders who understand assimilation and discipleship. Small groups in Sunday school, and then our administration adjusting to be as effective as possible. Now, this list comes from a book called Comeback Churches. And some of you have that book already. And we're going to talk more about it. And we're going to post some YouTube videos on it. We're going to have links that you can study this. And we're going to use this as a primer to help us, like Joshua, get ready to step into the promised land. Now, what was the first thing that Joshua and the new generation, what was the first thing they experienced when they crossed the river? Jericho. There's no party. There's no welcome home. There's there was no potluck dinner. There was a fight. But a fight that a free people could win because they were ready. They had the faith. They knew how to listen. They knew how to march. They knew how to blow the trumpet. They knew how to parade in worship. You see, that's what brought the walls down. As we come and receive communion, here's what I want you to do. I want you to think about Joshua, looking over into the promised land. We've been reminded of our covenant. We've been marked by it. Now we're going to remember the Passover. We're going to celebrate the Passover. We're going to remember what God has done for us. When we receive communion, we are remembering what Jesus has done for us. But make no mistake, we're promised land people. We're promised land people. We're not going to die in the wilderness. We're going in. You ready? We're going in.